this was a family, a community where like people don't lock their doors, everything's open. You know, you come home, like, I don't think any of us as kids had keys to the house. Like, the doors were never locked. I came home and all the doors were locked, and there's a note on the front porch that says, hey, pay the bills or I'll put all your stuff on the street. Well,
oh my God.
You know, like right that day that I graduated, my dad ended up going out on a runner. My mom didn't know how to pay the bills. Like, so she, you know, my stepmom, she put the bills out there, and I ended up like going, okay, I'm not paying the bills. I need some money to take with me to college, and I can't pay the family bills all the way through the summer. And so she followed through on her threat. Like, I came back later in the day and all my stuff was on the porch, and right. And ended up couch surfing through the summer and having to kind of deal with, you know, other people's substance abuse at 18 was pretty challenging. Right.
This is Rock Bottom with Ryan. No sugarcoating, no filters. The pain, the chaos, the truth. No bullshit. Just recovery.
Hey everybody, just want to welcome you to another episode of Rock Bottom with Ryan, and just want to let you know that this episode is brought to you by Sober Strong Apparel. Sober Strong Apparel isn't just lifestyle wear, it's battle gear. Heavyweight tees, hoodies, and gear for ones who draw a hard line. Clean, sober, no compromise. We rep sobriety like a badge of honor. And every piece you throw on says you're a part of the crew that doesn't back down. And every order fuels recovery with 10% donated to treatment facilities. And if you use the code ROCKBOTTOM, all one word, capital letters, ROCKBOTTOM, for 15% off on SoberStrongApparel.com, you can look at all these heavyweight tees, all these hats, banners, sweatshirts like this one. So many good options. The style is incredible. I love what this company represents. If you have anybody you know in recovery, any family, sober curious people in your life, or for yourself, if you're in recovery, this is the gear for you. Great style, comfortable, and the quality is amazing. Thank you so much for your support. Don't forget to subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, everywhere else. Follow us on social media. Thank you so much for all your support. And remember to check out SoberStrongApparel.com. Thanks a lot, y'all. Enjoy this episode. All right, welcome to another episode of Rock Bottom with Ryan, here with my co-host Rachel Sereni today, and we have our guest Denny LaVé here. How you doing, Denny?
I'm well. I am
talking to you from New York City. That's awesome.
I never dreamed that I'd be in New York and be on the billboard in Times Square, but that's why I was here today. So it's pretty wild stuff.
We're going to need a picture of that to post on this episode.
Okay. When the photos show up from the group I was with, I definitely would get you one because it's pretty cool.
Awesome. All right. Big shot in New York. That's pretty cool. That's awesome. And we definitely want to get into why you're on a billboard at some point towards the end of the interview. But first and foremost, can you kind of give us a little background of where you're originally from, which I'm familiar with the state, but I want you to say it. And then just a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go into childhood and stuff.
Yeah. So originally I'm from Montana. I was born in Billings, Montana. And then, you know, my family breakup started around the time I was 4, so that took me all over the western U.S. It took me into California, Utah, back to California, back to Utah. We kind of bounced all over the West as a kid, and ended up settling down in Idaho, then left to go to a monastery, stayed in a monastery for almost 2 years, and then settled down into Idaho, and now I've been in Idaho for 26 years.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, I myself live in Idaho. I live in Lewiston, so.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So you probably know where I live then. I live close to Worley. I'm not in Worley, but I'm close to Worley.
Yeah, I know of it. Yeah, it's like there's so many
I'm so far from
Rachel's
both of
over
you.
in Florida.
I'm in Florida.
Okay. All right.
So you traveled a lot as a kid, and you said it started at the age of 4?
Yes.
Okay. And this was with your mother?
No. So for those not familiar with the early 80s, like the economy kind of tanked late 70s, early 80s. And so my dad ended up going to California for work. And, you know, for whatever reason, he decided that he was going to take my sister and I down. And then we didn't see my mom. We didn't talk to her for 6 months. And next thing you know, we're going through divorce proceedings, and of course, in California, they're sending us kids to child psychologists to try to figure out where we want to go and how we're handling all of this, and it was just a, remarkably ugly situation.
Yeah. So so what was childhood like, in the sense, like I noticed, reading up on a little bit of like some facts about you and stuff. You endured childhood abuse. Are you open to comfortable talking about some of the stuff that you endured in that sense?
Yeah. So mine, I think it's altogether too typical, but it's also something that a lot of times is overlooked and not talked about. And that's that, like, kids aren't supposed to be exposed to a lot of sexual material and hypersexualized. And, like, I got my first exposure to pornography at roughly 3 years old. And then, was in a fairly hypersexualized environment, and lots of pornography exposure growing up and a lot of hypersexual content. And that, when a child is exposed to that material, their brain's not ready to handle it. And it can carve in some pathways that are not healthy, some response mechanisms that are not healthy. And as we learn about, like, brain wiring and brain development, what we see is that trauma responses, they tend to wire in at the developmental stage that the brain is in when things happen. And so, then that starts to impact things when we're older, right? Like, we start having trauma responses to things, to stressors as we're older, and we can't figure out why it keeps bypassing, the decision-making functions of the brain, and why it keeps seeming to go on autopilot.
Yeah, the frontal lobe, it's like it's not working anymore. You just kind of
Correct.
fight or flight, and you choose fight. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And it's one of those where it's like, okay, it makes, once you learn the brain science behind it, that helps to deal with the shame component, because you realize, like, okay, you have response mechanisms that are wired into your autonomic nervous system. And you don't think about breathing, and you can't consciously turn that breathing off. You can control your breathing to an extent, and you can control your responses to an extent, but there are times where your autonomic nervous system just takes over and says, this is what we're doing. Have a nice day. Right.
Yeah.
And when you get bad response mechanisms programmed into those parts of the brain, it takes a lot of work to develop the skill set to work around that, and to help, if you will, regulate your emotional breathing and your response mechanism responding. So,
And as a child, due to all of that, did that have you acting out in a sense? Like, how was your behavior like, or were you more quiet and reserved?
I think a lot of times the pattern there plays out into the, like, you have this deep sense of shame. And so in order to try to prove that you're worthy, you push to excel at things. Right. So we see the pattern a lot where, people have been exposed to pornography or sexuality or direct physical sexual abuse, and they tend to push themselves really hard in school, right? Because it gives them some sense of self-worth. And so you have this crazy dichotomy happening where it's like, man, I'm getting straight A's, I'm getting great test scores, and I'm doing this stupid stuff, and I'm doing great, and I'm doing excelling in sports and getting accepted to college and getting scholarships, and I'm doing this stupid stuff. And I don't understand why. And I feel like a terrible human, and depending on, a lot of, I think, the social mechanisms around us and the basic moral teachings that we have, rightly condemn a lot of those activities and those actions. And yet, without the context, I think it sets a person up to be in this kind of death spiral of shame and despair.
Yeah. I mean, as a victim of sexual abuse when I was younger, I can tell, like, what you were talking about earlier about how it affects your overall outlook on everything else in life, not just how I act when it comes to sex, which it totally affected that, gradually into my adult life too. Like, I know it affected it my entire life, but also just affected me trying to distract myself with other things, like you said, getting into school or focusing on this or that, just to try to, like, validate yourself in so many other ways, because you are trying to fill some kind of void, or, numb that pain that you suffered.
Or it's numb the pain. It's you're trying to impress your family members that, like, you really are a good person. You really are worthwhile, like, because you're doing so well over here. So could we please forget about the bad stuff I did over here? And it just never works. Right.
Exactly.
It's still a performative ethic.
Yeah, I was always trying to get good grades and perform well in sports and stuff like that, but I still had so many issues on the side that I was trying to neglect and distract from. So I
Hmm.
totally get that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
could understand. I mean, I was not a victim of that myself, but I could totally understand why you would want to feel validation of some sort. So being a good student, you would receive the grades so you get the validation. But for how long, if you don't mind me asking, did the abuse last for?
I think that early exposure, that started to kind of correct probably mid elementary school, but by then like the patterns were established. And so then it was a feed the problem type thing when things go wrong, when things go hard. Right. So like I have, I can pinpoint a time where like I kind of went down the wrong path deeply, at around 12 or 13, right? Where it was like, my biological mom had the two of us and my older sister and I, and then that was it. She wasn't having any more kids. And then all of a sudden, downstream somewhere, she's going to have more kids. And it was this deep sense of like, I'm not enough.
Mm.
Right.
Yeah.
And that triggered, running down some dark pathways.
Mhm.
So again,
I
it's kind of, I think it's one of those conversations where a lot of people will probably resonate with this. Like it's very challenging to conceive of it as abuse because it's more of a neglect and more of almost a miss in parenting, right?
yeah.
Where like as parents, we're supposed to protect our children from these nefarious things, these nefarious substances, right? Like we would all very obviously want to protect our kids from being and having access to cocaine or methamphetamines, right? Like we
Mhm.
wouldn't leave that lying around. And yet somehow, sexually explicit material and pornography and like we think a lot of parents don't take the efforts to protect their kids from that. And I think it's largely because they don't understand the gravity and the psychological and the neurological damage that's being done.
Yeah.
And then when they do discover it, like they're ashamed, they're angry. So then they pass on that shame and anger to their kids.
Right.
One of the episodes for me that was a turning point, and this happened much, much later in life, was listening to a priest relate a conversation he had with a family who had discovered that one of their sons was engaging in pornography. And then the boy was maybe 12 and the parents were upset. And of course the parents had yelled at him and berated him and it kept happening. And so they finally went, and took him to the priest and the priest sat with them. And he looked at the boy and he's like, well, I would say, Jimmy, how do you think, what do you think Jesus would do? Like if he saw you doing this. And the boy was like, he'd be so angry. He'd be upset. He'd come yell at me. He'd be really angry. And this priest was like, no, he would come over to you. He would hold you. He would tell you that an enemy has done this to you, that he loves you, and he's going to do everything he can to make this right. And he would tell you that over and over again until you believed it.
Yeah.
And then that story still touches me to this day, right? Because, I don't think a person should have to wait until they're, 40 something to hear that message.
Yeah. And I can tell that that makes you emotional and just,
Mhm.
kind of learning a little bit about you, reading up on some of the things. It sounds like things got very tough during your teen years. If you're okay with talking about it, it sounds like there was a suicide attempt. Did that have a lot to do with that pain that you were suffering from that?
That actually came a lot later in life. My teen years were pretty crazy. A lot of bouncing back and forth, changing schools,
Mhm.
and then it kind of culminated with my senior year where like we moved back to Utah for my senior year, but the school that I had gone to before was not the one that I was in the district of. And so in order to go there, I had to drive myself there. Well, then I wrecked my car, at the beginning of the school year. So then I had to ride a bicycle. Ogden, Utah is not exactly a hospitable place to ride your bicycle in the wintertime,
Mhm.
but I did it, right? I drove from Slaterville down to South Ogden, Utah every day, unless there was a blizzard going. And then there was actually a teacher who probably was breaking some rules who would give me a ride to school. when it was blizzarding. Otherwise it was, bundle up and toughen up and get to school. Anyways, during the course of my senior year, like my parents' issues kind of ratcheted up. And, by this time, dad, stepmom, I mean, they had very deep substance abuse issues going on.
And you grew up in poverty too.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, because of course, substance abuse leads to poverty, right? I mean, they kind of go hand in hand, right? Like things can be good when everybody's clean and sober, but then people fall off the wagon and all of a sudden there's no money and the bills pile up and it's really a lot of instability. So,
yeah,
I graduated from high school and I came home the next day from work, and this was a family, a community where like people don't lock their doors, everything's open. You come home, like I don't think any of us as kids had keys to the house. Like the doors were never locked. I came home and all the doors were locked, and there's a note on the front porch that says, "Hey, pay the bills or I'll put all your stuff on the street." Well,
oh my God,
like I right that day that I graduated, my dad ended up going out on a runner. My mom didn't know how to pay the bills. Like, so she, my stepmom, she put the bills out there, and I ended up like going, okay, I'm not paying the bills. I need some money to take with me to college, and I can't pay the family bills all the way through the summer. And so she followed through on her threat. Like I came back later in the day and all my stuff was on the porch, and right. And ended up couch surfing through the summer and having to kind of deal with, other people's substance abuse at 18 was pretty challenging. Right. And then you go off to college and you don't have any family support, and, that's not exactly a recipe for success. And so
it's tough.
Yeah, it led to some turbulent times.
Yeah,
sure.
sure.
And during those times, how did you cope with everything?
Did you ever have the desire or urge to start using yourself? Did you ever get in that position to make that decision?
Not illicit drugs or anything like that. There was, part of, I think, the issue at college was, you go to college, everybody's throwing parties, so easy access to alcohol, and that didn't help at college. But I've never felt the temptation to do any hard drugs, soft drugs, anything like that. It's, I've always had a kind of a pretty big abhorrence to that because I've seen the carnage that can wreck.
Yeah.
So, what I did, like when I was a senior in high school, I mean, I was, you're up at 6:30 in the morning to ride the bike to school. And then, I think my senior year, I had 6 AP classes, plus I was studying for one on the side because, there's only 6 periods in the school day. I played football. I acted in the school play. I had a full-time job. So I didn't have a lot of time to get into a lot of trouble my senior year. That helped a lot. But I think to the extent that I was in trouble, it was mostly the typical, you have a history of thinking that sexuality is going to solve your problems.
Yeah.
And so you pursue some of that. And of course, it doesn't solve any problems. It just complicates and makes life worse.
Yeah.
Especially, as it's met with the shame and, negativity. So,
yeah. So you although you didn't resort to drugs and like all the things that a lot of people do, you still felt like you had your own sets of toxic behaviors on the outside.
Yeah. I think so.
And you did attempt suicide at one point?
I did. That came later. So we kind of reconciled. I started a business with my dad in 2008, and having not dealt with any of these issues, right? Like not even realizing that there were issues that needed to be dealt with. So we started a business. It's done very, very well. But we got to a place, I think it might have been 21, 22, where it's like he wanted to retire. Our relationship was still super turbulent. And by this time, I think my having not dealt with a lot of the stuff that I needed to deal with going into marriage had kind of built up to a point where like it was causing some distress at home and some distress there. And so we got to this point where like I was going to buy out my dad's half of the business because he wanted to retire. And, we're at the end of a good year. We're doing our company Christmas party. We're trying to get this deal done. We have a deadline for the funding. And, it comes down to some small terms. And he's like, yeah, I don't trust you to pay me back. And I don't think you can do this. And then we have this highly emotional Christmas party. And then we're going home. And I'm just like, I wanted to hold my wife's hand right on the way home from this party. And she's like, no, I can't do that right now. Like, I'm really upset. And, I'm like, okay, but what's going on? And she's like, well, if I hold your hand, like, it'll make you think everything's okay and everything's not okay. And I can't tell you about it right now, but I'm really, and so I went I went to my room, and this time, the two of us were living in separate places. She's living in the guest room, I'm living in the master bedroom. And I went to bed, and I woke up the next morning, and I'm like, wow, like, there's a gun here on this side of the bed. There's another one on this side of the bed. Like, whichever way I roll, there's a gun, and I'm going to shoot myself. And I'm like, I can't do that. And I curled into a ball and waited for the feeling to pass, and it still wasn't going away. And I'm like, I got to get somewhere safe. And I ended up going into our master closet and, like, locking myself in the master closet, going, well, okay, like, at least there's no guns in here. I'll be safe until this passes. And it kind of terrified everybody, right? My wife, my mom was actually there for the vacation, for the Christmas season, and was like, okay, I can't continue going down this pathway of just trying to do minor fixes and, trying to carry everybody and everything. I can't do it.
Yeah. You're exhausted.
Right? I was exhausted. Exactly. And
wow. So how did you get yourself out of that, and how'd that go?
That was my next question.
Rachel and I are always on the same page.
So I built out some pretty solid support networks, and a lot of it professional, right? And then insisted on working through some different modalities, right? I was working with somebody who was essentially a cognitive behavioral therapist, but not purely that. I'm like, okay, we're going to work on someone who does EMDR and some internal family systems work. Then I had a you call it pastoral therapist. It was more just hey, we're just going to get together and we're going to chat like we're, father son, like, and this is going to be what a healthy father son relationship actually looks like. We're just going to do that. And then, layered into like going to church every day. And making sure that I get some spiritual time and some time to meditate and reflect, and making sure that I got exercise every day. And just kind of building out this regime that basically said, look, work is going to play second fiddle. I'm not going to push hard on the family side to resolve issues that clearly can't be resolved yet. And I'm going to dig into a lot of these underlying issues, right?
Right.
And I think it's interesting how we got to that point, because, when I first committed to getting some professional help with a lot of the stuff I was experiencing, after a few sessions, the therapist was like, oh, I think we're going to have to dig into your childhood, because I think that's where the root of all this is. And I'm like, F you.
Yeah.
I built a wall around that stuff for a reason, and there's no way I'm tearing that wall down. Like, I am not going back. And, fast forward, 4 or 5 years, and it's like, okay, that's clearly where I have to go. That's clearly where the work has to be done.
Yes. You do have to get down to the root of the issue, which starts in childhood. And I did EMDR from my mother's passing, and I did not want to do that. It taps really into deep memory, and it was hard, but you do get past it, and it's worth it. It's worth it, but you have to relive the trauma when you do EMDR. So that's the scary part. But that's when you're getting the right help, like you're healing. So.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was talking to somebody this morning about brain spotting and EMDR. They're pretty much, you basically try to go into your memories and figure out exactly what you're trying to heal from, and like target it, and then actually work through it and like relive it. And it sounds really intense. I've never done it, but
yeah,
I feel like I'd finally get emotional.
You will.
Yeah. That's actually, this is going to sound crazy. I didn't realize how emotionally numb I had gotten. And then now, after going through the different modalities and the work that I've been, I could feel the emotions a lot more as they come on.
Yeah.
And at the same time, like, there's still this hesitancy sometimes where I feel like this big overwhelming wave of something that needs to release. And it's like, I don't know if I can let that go.
Yeah, that's how I am still in sobriety, and I still try to hold myself, just be like, no, I can push those emotions aside. And then one day I just feel like exploding, and I still don't let myself do it. So it's been a big issue and topic that we discuss a lot on this podcast, is me and letting out my emotions. So Could go on forever about that. But did this lead you into going over to France to be a monk, or how'd that happen?
Yeah, tell us about
So,
that.
when I was growing up, I became a Catholic at about 12 years old. And at various points as a young man, I thought about going into the priesthood or going into religious life. Was kind of convinced that's where I was supposed to go, but also was like, no, I don't want to do that. No, I don't want to do that. I'm going to go to college. Everybody's telling me I should go to college. And then that didn't work. And then I joined the Marine Corps because I'm like, okay, I need some discipline in my life. I had a massive heat stroke and, hit 108 degrees on a 2-mile run and spent 3 days in ICU. And, I remember being in the ER in an ice bath and my drill sergeant going, "Oh, you don't have permission to die, son." Right.
Oh my God.
And that experience was like, okay, God, you win. I'll go.
Wow.
I'll go wherever you want me to go. I'll go. And of course, that's not as easy as said as done. It's not as easy to do as it is to say, right? And so it took a little bit to pull that together, pay off debt, and get to a place where I could actually do that. But eventually, at about 20, golly, would have been 97, 99 is when I went. And at the very beginning of 99, I went for almost 2 years, and it was amazing.
1,000-year-old monastery. Wow. And how was that experience? Just incredible, and you came out of it just a whole new person, or how did that go?
It was incredible. I was ready to stay, right? I initially got there. I was homesick. I kind of took a vow going, look, I'm not quitting. I refuse to leave unless, God, you tell me that you want me to leave. And otherwise I'm sticking with this. Doesn't matter, what my whims are. I'm doing this. And so as I finished up my year of novitiate, I was very committed, and I was very certain that this is what I was supposed to do. Okay, I'd like to take my vows. And they're like, yeah, actually, we think you should go home and get married and have a family. It's like,
well,
okay, but
and you did.
I did, and I would say it definitely changed my life, and it gave me a different perspective. You can't live somewhere where, a tract home is built to last 200 to 300 years, right? And where people are routinely living in houses that are 500 or 600 years old and not have that change kind of how you see the world, right? And then, everywhere you go, something happened 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, and it's all documented. And then you come home and it's like, oh, this building's on the historic register of buildings and it's 100 years old.
I know. You're like, no, I was in places that were 1,000 years old.
Okay, yes, it's old by our standards, but it's not really old. And it does give a different perspective, and I think in relation to this conversation, one of the things I can look at is I can honestly say that some of those signs of that underlying, neurological trauma response, were evident. And I don't want to go into the details necessarily right now, but it was pretty clear, that's probably one of the things that the brothers and priests over there were kind of sensing and going, okay, this is maybe beyond our natural ability to heal. It's going to heal eventually, but it's best if he goes home,
Yeah. So what, did some of your near-death experiences take place before or after this? I heard you had a few of those. Was there any that are notable ones that took a while to recover from the trauma?
Other than the heat stroke.
Yeah, heat stroke.
The heat stroke one is probably one of the bigger ones, but
oh wow.
Some of the bigger ones, I don't know why they didn't register necessarily as these huge traumas, right?
Yeah.
I stood on top of was building a water tower in Marysville, Washington, and we were halfway done with standing up the precast walls, and we had a brace failure. And so one of the columns tipped over and was on the verge of wiping out the entire structure. And I happened to be standing on top of this structure, 60 feet in the air. Right. And it seems like it's all unfolding in slow motion.
Yeah.
Well, what do you do? My response was, okay, I'm going to untie, even though that's against the law, I'm going to untie from the top of this structure that I'm standing on because I want to control which way I go when it all comes down instead of having the
True.
building drag me down with it.
Yeah, in the harness or whatever.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that's frightening.
Mhm.
So you stepped onto a different structure to avoid falling with it?
Actually, interestingly, the column that tipped over, it ended up pinning a man lift up against the wall that my partner was in, and then it got stopped sliding down the man lift before it collapsed the structure.
Oh wow.
Jeez.
And so we were actually able to use the crane to grab a hold of it again, and stand it back up and carry on building the building.
Make it work. Wow, that's
Oh my
crazy.
God.
Huh.
But it's like,
So
okay,
what did
like that's. Oh, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, what did this do to you mentally after was the heat stroke before this?
Yeah, the heat stroke was would have been in '97, and this building that nearly collapsed would have been like 2002.
And experiencing both of those things and then living through it, did that give you a different perspective of life, or did that just make you more like a little more like frazzled and traumatized?
The heat stroke definitely felt like a message event.
Yeah.
That felt
Mhm.
like a, hi, I'm here and I have something for you to do and you're not doing it. And I just want you to know that I'm here. That definitely hit home as you need to change what you're doing. The, standing on top of a building that was almost going to collapse, that one was more of a,
Trauma.
I don't, yeah, because I've never really registered as a trauma, right? I mean, I've had other buildings where I've had another one that was on the verge of collapse that I got underneath it to shore it up.
Oh my
And,
God.
and I literally made my workers, like, pass me the material that I needed to shore it up because I didn't want them to get under the building in case it collapsed.
Wow.
And that, and I definitely, took some time to breathe, but I never really I didn't process it as trauma.
Well,
But like
I've
I've
heard that just a lot of people that go through different traumas, sometimes people seem to register what would be traumatic for somebody else as not really trauma for them, just because they've experienced trauma in other ways that sometimes it's just, yeah, that was nothing. That didn't phase me, but then
Yep.
something else might actually be traumatic for me.
yeah, and I mean, I've had stuff fall and hit me on the hard hat and, knock me senseless. And it's just kind of one of those, like, okay, if anything, these incidences have kind of led me to a place of, like, I'm very much a person of faith. I very much believe that God is active in my life.
Mhm.
And it reinforces to me the sense of I'm in his hands.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and as damaged and broken as I may be, I'm still in his hands and he still loves me and he still has something he wants me to do.
Yeah. So
It
you had a
sounds like you
purpose.
got a message like that when you were a monk and you got out, and then you basically got a message saying you need to go get married and have kids and stuff. So how did you meet your wife? And you guys had 6 kids, and how did you do all that and become an entrepreneur and all that?
So I met my wife at church, and I had, when I got back from the monastery, they asked me to run the youth group at our church. And I said, yes, I would do that. And I persuaded her older brothers to come to the youth group, and she would tag along, but she wouldn't participate because she was busy, correcting homework for the classes that she was teaching at this little tiny elementary school. And she would be planning lessons and it was just like, I kept seeing her and going, that's the one, I'm going to get to know her. And she seems like an amazing woman, and it's kind of this funny blend of like, yes, I fell in love, but it was also okay, this is the type of person I would like to be, my wife when I get older. And this is the type of person I would like to be the mother of my children. And then to work out relationship from there. And I know that probably sounds very unromantic from an American standpoint, but it was kind of a look at, if I'm getting married, like the plan would be to have a family, and probably a bit of a response to not wanting to have a relationship that ends in divorce, right? Like, I don't know. I think it's very common for those of us who've gone through childhood divorces to kind of have this mindset of, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's exactly how I thought.
That's exactly what I'm
And
going
part
through
of that,
now.
I think part of the growth, that's what you're going through.
Oh yeah, I just got married. How long ago was that? I'm going on 2 weeks tomorrow. I got married. 100%. I don't ever want to live that way. I don't want to go through divorce like my
Yeah.
parents.
Yeah. And so I think for me, a shift has been to go, how do I want to live? Like, what do I actually want in this relationship and in this marriage, as opposed to what I don't want? And then, as my wife and I have been working on healing and on restoring relationship, just being patient and thinking, what do I want it to look like? What does a healthy relationship actually look like, as opposed to well, whatever happens, I don't want that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's good that you look at it from that perspective.
So
100%.
Because I grew up around divorce and witnessed quite a few failed relationships and marriages firsthand. And I told myself, getting old, as I got older, I'm like, I'm just never going to get married for that reason. Or if I do get married, I'm just going to have my mind ready for divorce. And I did get married and divorced, but, I went into it with a negative mindset, and I went into other relationships with a mindset that, hey, it's going to fail at some point. It's inevitable.
yeah, and that's a challenge I think that so many people face today, right? I'm a Catholic. I go to a traditional Latin mass. The Catholic Church historically has been super hardcore on the indissolubility, like that marriage is permanent, regardless of if the parties involved in the marriage break it up. It doesn't go away, and you're not free to remarry. And in the modern church, the modern era, we see a lot more people getting an annulment, which is like a certificate that says this marriage never actually happened. And I've tried to reconcile myself with those two things, going, well, on the one hand, you look back at England, and like the Catholic Church was willing to say, okay, we would rather see this entire country separated from the faith than to say that marriage can be broken on demand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this modern era where we're seeing all this, all these marriages declared null, and, not to pass judgment on any of it, but just to go, well, what if our current climate, our current situation among so many of us is so fractured and broken that a lot of people actually aren't able to take that commitment freely and fully, like, because it's a big thing, right? To really, when you are hurt and have been deeply hurt over and over as a youth and as a child, I can imagine, yeah, it's very hard to get to a place of full commitment, of full surrender to the process and to the institution.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I get it.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what inspired you to write a memoir then, and what's that about? And like, was that about your life in Idaho and you're getting married and having kids? And can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. Well, so the memoir came as okay, if I'm going to run for office, I think people deserve to know who I am. And if I'm going to tell people who I am, then I'm going to do my best to tell as much of the truth as I can about who I am. Right. A lot of times, and I don't know about you, but, we think politicians portray themselves as we know who they are. And we really don't. They put on a public veneer, and they live this public veneer, and then downstream somewhere we find out that they're actually not the person we thought they were, and everybody's upset. And I thought, okay, one of the best ways to help people get to know me would be to put this book out and to really just open up about, like, this is who I am. And as we approached the project, it was like, well, what do you want to tell? And I'm like, well, I think I need to talk about my story, because the more I think about it, the more I think, you know what, this is actually all too sadly a very American story today. Right? Because it's so many Americans that are in middle age and young adulthood today have been through, their parents breaking up. As I was working on my healing, one of the things I came across was like, 1 in 3 women in their lifetime will be sexually abused. And 1 in 10 men will have been sexually abused in their lifetime. There's such a stigma about talking about these things, right? And of talking about these human traumas and tragedies and dramas, because people would rather just have you just, suck it up and just tough it out, especially for men, right? Just tough it out. Like,
Yeah.
pardon the vulgarity, but, stop being a pussy.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, if it were only that simple, right? But the reality of neurobiology, that doesn't change just because people make fun of it.
Right.
And it doesn't change just because people don't have the emotional maturity themselves to handle the consequences of what societally and they themselves may potentially have been doing.
Mm-hmm. And
So that's why I wrote the book, was to get very real about my story with people, because the reality is that a lot of people have the same pain. A lot of people have gone through similar problems. And wouldn't it be great if we had leaders that actually understood what we were going through and could help make changes in our society to help us get to a better place?
About kind of how you could be more vulnerable with the people, since you're wanting people to get to know you and your story more and it's more relatable. And
yeah, that's essentially it, right? As I think, wouldn't it be great if we had people in office making laws that actually had, were able to actually talk about the experiences they've had and bring that to bear to make our country better?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
And
awesome.
that leads me into asking, what got you into politics? What got you into doing that?
About 18 years ago, I was listening to a politician speak that claimed to share the same faith, but was clearly pushing things that were against our faith. And I thought, okay, look, I looked at this guy's background, where he came from. Like, if he can do this, I can do it. And I talked to a mentor. They said, no, not yet. Just keep working on your family, your business, raise your kids. So I did. And then, fast forward 2024, I had, at the end of the year, I was planning 25, and I looked like I was going to have a fair amount of time. And I was very much, praying for guidance, and got the message, hey, it's time to run. And I'm like, I don't know about that. Time out. Like, if this is really what you want, please send one of my mentors to tell me. And a few days later, one of my mentors, I came up unsolicited and said, hey, are you still thinking about running for office? And okay, well, it's time to do it. So
wow,
it's like, okay, all right, God, I asked you to send somebody to tell me, and you did. And so here we go. Let's go do this. And,
confirmation.
It's not a small thing, right? It's, yes, it's a major office. I get that. But it's also, you're taking on an incumbent. I've put a significant amount of my own personal wealth that I've accumulated over the past, 18 years of running my business into this campaign and into getting the visibility needed to win. And that's not to be taken lightly. So I'm glad that confirmation was given that it was the direction to go.
That's awesome. So you're CEO and leader of Precision Precast Directors, and you're kind of utilizing that knowledge and that leadership into running for Senate for Idaho?
Yep, that's correct. That's correct. And it just, I look at this and I go, what a crazy amount of life experience, right? Growing up in a crazy household, bouncing all over the place, but then, college and the Marine Corps and a monastery, to getting married, to having a company, and it's been a very successful company. It's been on the Inc. 5000 list 5 times. I, as a CEO, like I've been honored for my leadership and CEO skills at a national and at a global level. And it's like, okay, that might be a really radically different set of lenses to bring to view in the government compared to somebody who's, been a career politician since 1970, which is what my opponent is.
Wow.
And I like that you want to be relatable to your audience, in sense, the Americans. So, I mean, I like that. That's admirable.
It makes me sad that we feel like our politicians all have to be perfect. And rather than pretend to be perfect, I'd rather just get it out on the front side that, you know what, I'm not perfect.
Be authentic.
I'm very human.
Yeah.
I've had flaws. I've made mistakes. And that's,
I think it's incredible and so relatable. Just the fact that you grew up in a complicated household, and you could have chosen so many different directions, but you stayed focused. And it sounds like you went to college, you experienced the Marine Corps, which you just mentioned, you became a monk. It's like all
Yep.
these things that you did to stay on track, and you still have a lot of life experience, near-death experiences and stuff like that,
Yep.
a potential suicide attempt. And you have so much that so many real American people out there can relate to. I think that's really inspiring.
Yeah.
I agree.
I think especially, one of the things that we're seeing right now is like the highest levels of suicide that we've seen since we've been recording it. And having gone through that experience myself, I have a lot more understanding, a lot more compassion for people that struggle with that, right? Because it's almost like watching it happen to yourself, right? And like, you're not yourself, you're not in control at that moment. Like, the best you can do is try to seek shelter, and I think the other part of that experience was that, one of the things that hurt the most afterwards was my mom going, golly, I knew something was off. I didn't know what to say. Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping that, if we can bring some awareness to this, that actually it's okay if you don't know what to say, but say something. Like, that's sometimes enough to disrupt the circuit and to help somebody come back out of that place, is that somebody cared, somebody said something. So hopefully we can help more people say something, help more people, have the confidence to intervene, even though they feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, to open up when it's needed,
Yeah,
not take the straitjacket off. Yeah.
No, it is
I love that.
important.
I love what you're
Yeah, I was
love
gonna
what
say
you're
that.
doing, using your background in leadership and everything, and like all the hard work you put in to build a business. And it seems like you have a great wife. Her name's Gina, it sounds like, and kids and all that. And you're doing all this. What's daily life like now, running for Senate and all that, and putting aside your usual daily life, for precision precast and all that? It's like, what's life like now?
Well, like this year, we've put, since the beginning of the year, we've done over 20,000 road miles, and I don't know how many thousand air miles, back and forth. But, you get out in front of people. And I think I've had more public speaking in the last 3 months than I have in my, previous 49 years.
I bet.
Which has actually gone fine, right? I had the opportunity to go to a program called Heroic Public Speaking in 2018, which was a three-day class put on by Michael and Amy Port on improving your public speaking and really elevating your game. And I actually specifically went to that class thinking about, a future political run, going, okay, at some point God might call me to do this. And when he does, I need to have worked on this skill, because even with practice and even with repetition, standing up in front of a room of people who don't necessarily want to hear what you have to say, or don't necessarily,
You may not agree with everything either.
may not agree with you. Like, it's it could definitely cause the adrenaline to spike and cause, some of the things to start spinning in your head. And
Good. And has public speaking got easier? I mean, was it ever something you struggled with and you needed that confidence boost, and did that class really genuinely help?
it did help, because it gave me a framework and some skills that layered on top of what I'd already done. In the course of working as a leader in the construction industry. Like, I've clearly talked to my teams, clearly got up in front of them and talked on a regular basis. I had to get up in front of groups of other construction leaders and talk. But this was kind of trying to put a finer point to it, right? And trying to really go, it's not just the words you're saying, but it's how you're saying them, but it's also how you carry yourself on stage and the mannerisms and gestures that you use. But then it's also not just how you use them, but it's actually syncing those up to the words you're saying to make the words have more impact.
Wow.
And getting comfortable with silences, right? So that the words you say can actually have some impact, because, man, that's an uncomfortable thing, to be standing in front of a room full of people that expect you to say something, and then you pause and just wait, and they're all expecting something. Like, there's this almost palpable tension that builds, and then you do say something and it relieves the tension. And it's, the old fashioned art of rhetoric is a thing.
Yep. So true.
And Michael and Amy, they do a great job of helping people take it to the next level, of really elevating it from a performance perspective.
Cool.
So, and again, the reason they call it heroic public speaking is because they want to give people the tools to engage in public life and have a meaningful impact, positive impact, which I think is good. I think it's a noble effort.
Yep.
Oh, I highly agree on them.
So as of right now, as you're talking to us today, you're putting up a big billboard in Times Square.
Yeah, as part of, I was nominated as top CEO of 2026 by the International Association of Top Professionals. And part of that is they secure the billboard, the NASDAQ billboard on Times Square, and you get yourself displayed up on the billboard on Times Square. And so
that's huge.
It was
congratulations.
Kind of cool, right?
Congratulations.
And it's from the political side of it, I look at it and I go, Idaho has a history of really making an impact on the national stage. I know we're a small, from a population standpoint, we're a small state. Graphically, we're a very large state, but we have a history of really impacting the state and of really providing, some very strong leadership at the national and federal level. And to me, this was an opportunity to put myself on a national stage and show that, I can make that impact at the national level. I'm not afraid to get out on that big stage and bring our issues to the forefront. It's very different.
No, again, I mean, everything that you've been through, and then to hear where you are now in life, and then you're sharing your story to be a better politician to relate to the Americans. It's very admirable to me. So thank you for coming on the show and sharing all of that with us.
I agree.
If I can share something that I think before we started recording, we talked about recovery a tiny bit, and you mentioned, your work in that space. One of the things, like I've been in some recovery groups, and I always had a really hard time, and my dad is in some recovery groups now, and I have a very hard time with, it seems like the identity of the person, the people in there, they often seem to associate their identity with the illness, with the problem. And some of the work that I did, not in person, but through the books and the podcast with Dr. Bob Schutz, he presented a framework that I found super helpful. He says most people, they take on a role or a mission and they get their identity from their mission, right? Yeah. And then they get relationships through that. But that's not how we're meant to be. Because if the mission changes, then the identity gets lost and the relationships get lost. He flips that around. He says, look, we're meant to be in a relationship with God. And if we start there with that relationship, God has revealed to us our relationship. We are his beloved children. That's who we are. That's our identity. And he might send you on a mission, and he might change that mission midstream. And I've experienced this multiple times, right? From going to college and that not working, to going to the Marine Corps, to that not working, to going to a monastery, to that not working, to, being married, to having a company, to now potentially, being a United States Senator. And yet none of those things fundamentally changed the who I am. Mm-hmm. Because fundamentally who I am is one of his beloved children. And those are just things he might ask me to do. And I think if anybody who's listening to this, if they could just stop and realize that they are this beloved child and just sit with that's a life-altering reality.
That's great. Well said. I mean, that's usually a question we ask towards the end too, is what advice, because I feel like we do interview a lot of people that are directly former addicts or going through recovery as we speak, but hearing your story and just a lot of the things you've accomplished, I feel like your story promotes a lot of authenticity and being authentic and being comfortable with your true self and how you're created and stuff. So What specific advice would you give to people out there listening that, are struggling with their mental health and being who they want to be? As a father,
Well,
business
I
owner,
think very much
politician.
sit with that thought that the creator of the universe actually personally loves you. When you realize that the creator of the universe has this personal, intimate relationship for you, sit with that. And then I recounted that story of the priest who said, you know what, you're loved and you've been hurt and I want to make it better. And I'm going to do everything I can to make it better. Like, sit with that, because that's real. That's reality. And all the voices around us that have been condemning and full of shame, and like, that's the work of the enemy trying to drag us down. That's the work of the enemy trying to get us into the pit and break our mental health and break our spiritual health.
Yeah.
Perfectly said.
Yeah. 100%.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
So
really appreciate it, Denny.
if there's another piece to that, it's the Christians are often called out for not loving their neighbors well. And I think it's because we often forget that in order to love your neighbor well, you have to love yourself.
Mm,
So
Yeah.
true.
yeah.
And if you can't, when I struggled with this myself a long time, because it's not an acceptance of a bad behavior or of acting out. That's not what love of self is, but it's how would God treat me right now if he were standing next to me? How would he speak to me? How would he treat me? Even in those worst times, even when we're doing the worst things, even when we're not who we want ourselves to be, how would he treat me? And that's how I have to treat myself. That's loving myself. And then from that place, I'm able to show up to my neighbor with that correct love, and that'll change your world.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
that'll
so
change
true.
your world for sure.
100%.
Beautifully said. Seriously appreciate it, Denny. Like, thank you for being vulnerable on our show and coming
Yeah.
on. And you're doing so much. Like, you've already experienced so much in your life, but now you're using that knowledge and experience to help change the world directly, and it's pretty incredible. So we're very grateful for you.
Again, thank you.
Thank you guys for having me on. Thank
Of
you very
Thank you
much.
so much.
So I appreciate it.
And good luck with everything in your campaign, and really happy for you. All right. Thanks, Denny.
Thanks,
Thank
Ryan.
you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Rock Bottom with Ryan. No bullshit, just recovery.